It's very hard to understand this whole era of anti-communism, which was more or less impressed upon the American people. There was no evidence that this was really the state of affairs, except the traditional thing that any group in power in any nation has to have an enemy. And for reasons that are not clearly understood, immediately after World War II, it was decided that we had to have an enemy, and that was communism. And because it was communism, it was Russia, and it was China, without any other definition. That was just it. And then we've been brainwashed since. That may be changing today, it may not be changing, but I think it's changing because we also realize that military-type war is probably outdated now on account of nuclear weapons, and that warfare from here on will be economic warfare. It'll be just as tough, it'll kill just as many people, it'll cost just as much money, but it will be economic warfare.
One side question regarding this change, your sense in the change of warfare per se, occurred to me the other day. As you indicated, you feel that the military-industrial complex's influence and pervasiveness will lessen as the new economic warfare intensifies, particularly in the area of energy, as it's currently going now, as well as in the area of food, as you feel will become prevalent. What do you feel will happen with respect to the organization currently in place that you define as the secret team that seems to move in this industry of military defense industry?
I think we've seen an absolutely perfect example of what we're talking about in what is called the Arab oil embargo. You know, in the decade up to 1973, the price of a barrel of oil had been $1.70, and that was more or less worldwide. If you want to buy 100,000 barrels of oil, you paid 100,000 times $1.70, and you got the oil. At that price, oil was profitable. The companies were making enormous profits. The producers like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Iran or Russia were making profits with their oil. And then all of a sudden, they decided that they were going to increase the price of oil. And by they, I mean the high cabal, the people in great money. It's nothing but a money deal. It's nothing but a war. A war, like you fight in Vietnam, it's for money and nothing else. We didn't gain a thing except we spent between $250 and $500 billion fighting a war in Vietnam. Overnight, the price of oil went up. There was a battle between the Israelis and the Arabs. The story goes that the Arabs, as a result of that war, declared an embargo on the shipment of oil from the Middle East to the rest of the world, and that made the shortage of gasoline in the streets, and we could not get gasoline at our favorite gas pumps, and we had to pay more and more and more. We should look back at that carefully. The Arab-Israeli war was not conclusive. The Arabs gained on the first few days way into Israeli territory, and then a couple of weeks later the Israelis came back and went right away into the Egyptian territory, and then the war just ended. It was inconclusive. But all of a sudden the Arabs, according to the press, signaled an embargo on oil. Now that's the most ridiculous thing in the world, because the only income these Arabs have is the sale of oil. And furthermore, the oil that they produce comes from the ground all by itself, under pressure from the earth. They don't have to pump it. They had no great big problem with supplying oil. As a matter of fact, I can show you copies of the congressional record in which oil experts from the Middle East reported that exactly at this time of the Arab oil embargo, the storage tanks at the Arab facilities, whether it's Kuwait or Iraq or Saudi Arabia, were overloaded and bursting with oil, waiting for ships to come. A few years later, I was asked, as a representative of the Miracle Railroad System, to attend a conference in London at the Chartered Institute of Transport. And among the seminar groups that I met with there was one on petroleum transportation. A gentleman came into that room and lectured to only 8 of us who had come to that class. I was very glad I went to it. And one of the Englishmen in the room nudged me as the speaker was coming in the room and said, "Do you know this gentleman?" I said, "No." He said, this man is a multi-billionaire ship owner. It occurred to me, and has since, why would a multi-billionaire, in pounds, by the way, more than dollars, why would he want to come into a room with 8 people and lecture on petroleum transportation? Well, of course, a very good reason. That was all being recorded and would be printed in a book later, and so his words would become part of the record, and he's very proud of what he had been doing. What he told us was the same thing as these people reporting to the Congress, that there was no shortage of oil. What happened was that a very well-planned system was applied through the tanker industry, and they arbitrarily and absolutely controlled the movement of oil by not picking it up until the price was right. Now, in 1973, the Middle East produced and sold $15 billion worth of oil. By 1980, the same Middle East produced and sold $300 billion worth of oil. The quantity of oil they produced was not much different. The cost of producing it was not much different. But the sale price was $15 billion in 73, and 7 years later, it was $300 billion. I think anyone can understand that for $285 billion profit, it's worth doing almost anything in this world today. And that accounts for the Arab oil embargo, the shortage at the fuel pumps, and the fact that we Americans are paying $1.30 a gallon for gas when we used to pay 29 cents a gallon for gas. Well, it's this kind of control that is the new kind of warfare. Now, petroleum is not an absolute necessity of life. Energy is, and petroleum is a major factor in energy. But it is close enough to being a necessity so that this shortage of oil, this control of oil, really hurt people all over the world, and especially in the leading nations like ours, because overnight they increased one of the major expenses we have in the cost of running an automobile. So that this kind of war has as its battlefield the streets of America, with the streets of Paris, the streets of London, where our automobiles are, where our trains run, where our airplanes fly. And it is a completely different battle, but it is a battle for enormous profits and the controls that those profits get. Because once the price of oil goes up, the price of coal goes up, the price of natural gas goes up, the price of food goes up, everything. Because the cost of trucking becomes higher, and most of our food is moved by trucks, so that when the price of oil went up from 30 cents a gallon to $1.50 a gallon, all the rest of the price levels went up on the tide of oil, all escalated with the price of oil. And the cost of just plain living, day by day, escalated with the price of oil, and that price of oil was controlled by superpowers that control those industries. And the catalytic force in that was something as simple as a shipping industry. There is no way to get around the shipping industry. And this is a key. This is what was being explained also as we went to these meetings in London. That traditionally, oil from Iraq, the old oil fields of Kirkuk and Mosul, had traveled through a huge pipeline that went from Iraq through Jordan and to the port of Haifa in what was then Palestine. When the country of Israel was formed, one of the first things the Israelis did, for reasons that are not recorded, is close the pipeline terminus at Haifa. And Iraqi oil could not leave Iraq for the Mediterranean coast, and for Europe, most Iraqi oil is sold and consumed in Europe. Now, there are 8 other pipelines that extend from Iraq to the Mediterranean. They go to the port of Sidon in Lebanon, and other ports northward all the way up to Syrian ports. So we have seen those pipelines made dry by the Israeli attack on Lebanon. And we wonder why Israel should even bother to attack Lebanon, why Syria should be attacking Lebanon, and why poor old Neutron Lebanon, which is nothing but the market garden basket of Europe, is brought to its knees by a perpetual war until we realize that that war causes the pipelines from the Middle East to Europe to go dry. Yeah. this forces the oil onto the ships and under the controls that had been devised by the shipping cartels. And this is a fact of life. This is happening right today. The fighting in Lebanon is to keep the pipelines dry. The fighting between the Arabs and the Israelis is to keep the oil pipelines dry. It's not religious. It's not political. The Arabs have no choice. The Israelis receive $2.5–3 billion aid money from us a year, which is perhaps payment for their assistance. The Egyptians receive $2.5–3 billion from us. The most foreign aid money we pay to any countries in the world are to Israel and to Egypt. How does Egypt earn its money? It meters the Suez Canal to oil, and no oil goes through the Suez Canal. So the movement of oil causes the tide of prices to rise all over the world. And part of the device is to keep the pipelines of the Middle East dry. During the Iraq-Iran war, the Iraqis even attempted to build a pipeline through Turkey. And they were forced so much to export oil that they were exporting, I believe, almost 1 million barrels of oil a day by truck through Turkey. Now, that's not profitable. That's a terrible cost for oil. They couldn't get it down the river through Abadan. Their Persian Gulf ports had been destroyed. The Iranians couldn't get oil out of Iran. Their ports had been destroyed. They were bargaining with Turkey to run a pipeline across Turkey out of Iran, and again, billions of dollars being spent on that pipeline, so which raises the price of oil beyond its economic levels, so that the war between Iraq and Iran was simply to create a shortage of oil from those two countries, which would create a higher price because of the lesser amount of oil available around the world. So it's this kind of economic control of a major commodity, oil, that is the new type of warfare between nations on earth. And we're going to see more of this because it produces such enormous profits. When the Middle East was making $300 billion in 1980 on the oil that it exported, that represented about 40% of the world's total, meaning the rest of the world was selling for maybe $400 billion for its oil. Oil that only 7 years earlier would have sold for $16 to $18 billion. The profits are enormous. They're unbelievable.
I'd like to go back